Hi, I'm Robbie and this is the third video already in the Art Start Story series. The first video provides a general introduction and discusses the importance of balance in a work of art. In the second video, we discuss portraits and how they can be used in story writing. This video explores the different types of storytelling words and how they can be related to your writing. With the last examples, we already saw how the background can become very dominant. We saw this in the work of Jenny Saville, and how the portrait even become a part of the background, which we saw in my father's self-portraits. That's how I more or less arrived at the storytelling artwork. A storytelling artwork can be tremendous help in writing your own story, simply because it already has a story. However, creating your own story is precisely one of the goals of practicing the new language. For people with very little imagination, such a storytelling artwork can still be very helpful. And for others, well, it's not bad to simply copy the story the artwork depicts, but it's probably a less effective exercise. Of course, it also depends on the type of artwork, but usually you can do much more with it. So let's explore a few possibilities. So storytelling artwork has a very long history, for the simple reason that photography didn't exist in the past. Visual art served primarily to depict how things looked elsewhere, and also to portray important and rich people and historical events, whether or not based on facts and from the perspective of the artist or the client. Those paintings are created with the purpose of providing information or making the viewer believe something. The first major step was the invention of the printing press. Before the printing press, there were unique works of art, works of which there was only one example, often very beautiful, and this 15th century gradual book made by Friedrich Zollner. You can see how beautiful he described the P and the music behind it. Even though copies were made, they were never exactly the same. In addition, there was printmaking, which meant that multiple copies of an artwork were available. Techniques used for this printing including etching, screen printing, woodcuts and various others, and they're still using them. Printmaking became particularly popular when Johannes Gutenberg began printing with movable types in 1455. Unique copies are still made today, booklets with the same but slightly modified illustration and each with a slightly different storyline. This is different from a larger print storybook where each new chapter begins with the same situation and illustration, and the story then continues in a different direction. In fact, this principle is often used for detective and crime novels, where the basic story is told from the perspective of, for example, the victim, and later from the perpetrator and the investigator. For the time the printing press came into use, books became printed in increasingly large editions. Special editions featuring important texts were illustrated by often beautiful pictures. These initially served to support the text. Sometimes the text was depicted literally and very actively, sometimes more figuratively and often more passively, but still close related to the content of the text. With the advent of photography, film and video, the need for factual information was diminished, and as a result, visual art has changed enormously. This also applies to illustrations, and just with portraiture, we see different important styles: realistic, impressionistic, expressionistic, and abstract. In this video, I won't discuss storytelling abstract videos, as there will be a separate video about abstraction. But I share a famous example, Leone Leone's picture book Little Blue and Little Yellow. The adventures of two colors. Children love that, and there are only two colors. So what you should avoid, in my opinion, is describing what the viewer already sees. Also, avoid to put yourself in the shoes of the creator of the work to explain the story from that perspective. We do not know what the artist wanted to tell besides what we see. In my opinion, the art itself is clearer and more interesting than the descriptions. Anyone who regularly visits exhibitions is familiar with just about every variation of, oh, I work for myself, and oh, I explore the environment and I want to discover. Well, that's an excellent description of what everyone does from the day after we were born. So it's not really special. Only a few artists are good in communicating with non-artists, but most aren't. They are trained to create visual art, not to communicate through text, at least not with the general public. Among themselves, with college, it's completely different. They only need a few words to understand exactly what the other person means. However, communicating with the general public is often deplorable. Even in famous museums, you often see a painting depicting a tree. The frame around the painting has a beautiful, usually a copper plate, which also tells you that what you are seeing is a tree. And below the painting there is a text from the museum itself stating again that it is a tree. Visitors tend to read everything at the beginning. Even it's written 3 times the same, and that's very tiring. So it's essential a variation of the famous Droste effect. The Droste effect is, you see a nurse bringing a packet of cocoa, and on that packet she herself is depicting bringing a packet of cocoa, and on that thing she herself is bringing it, and so on. The oldest variation of this way of making a painting, it dates from the 14th century, and it's painted by Giotto. That's all I know about it. So don't make the same mistake in your story by repeating everything you already described. Especially if the description is also very in-depth, unless, of course, this is your style. As in the films of the Police Squad and the Naked Gun, there a police officer holds a stone and asks the technical staff if they can tell him anything about him, after which they start with, 5 million years ago the earth was a fireball. No, it's a long story. However, providing some form of more than necessary information can also be very effective. When I created an exhibition at the Ho Chi Minh City Fine Art Museum, I told the participating artists that I didn't want the usual text for the catalogue, but that they should make a selection of 5 other works so that the visitor could get a better impression of their work. Incidentally, the idea did come from me, but it was inspired by the book To Cut a Long Story Short by Charles Jongemans, among others, about text in museums. And that, in turn, was inspired by the famous saying, "Kill your darlings." The decision to eliminate an unnecessary plotline, a character or a favorite phrase, form a story to improve it as a whole. Now let some work speak from themselves. Jane Saville's work is very dynamic, yet the subject clearly dominates what's happening behind her. My father's works, with a combination of moments over many years, although the subjects, they're all doing something, nevertheless, it's a remarkable passive situation. So movement can also be depicted very literally, as in this work of Marcel Duchamp. And a good example, I love these paintings, I used in my video about aggression, it can be depicted in a very different way, is Francis Goya's diptych, the 2nd of May 1808 and the 3rd of May 1808. Both depict an action, But the action in the work of the second May is that despite it being a fight, it's very quite passive. It's more like an inventory. You see everything very clean painted, but it has no real movement. In the work of the third May, not much really happens, but the tension is immense. And with that painting I fell in love with his work, in fact. Those paintings are a good example of how an action can appear very passive, usually by describing it beautiful and as completely as possible. In fact, giving too much information, while a little movement, as in the second scene, can suggest a great deal of tension and therefore activity. So, for example, in your story, you could describe someone carefully considering how best to cross a puddle, how that person examines the option in detail and then carefully move forward, but does that indicate action? I don't think so. You could have also someone suddenly realize they have stepped into a puddle and notice that his feet are soaked wet. Incidentally, these things that happen spontaneously, as in this case, can suggest a real movement. But to make something suspenseful, the famous film director Alfred Hitchcock stated that when something happens suddenly, it's not nearly as suspenseful as when you know it's going to happen, but you don't know when. The trick then is to prolong it as long as possible. And you know there's going to happen something, but when? What are the important elements of a story that we find in visual work of art? Well, a story consists of various elements that together form a coherent whole. The most important elements are the character, the setting, the plot, the conflict, and the resolution. When choosing a work of art, we can choose which elements the artwork will support in the story. And those elements, they appear to the way we like to write. Naturally, we ensure that the dialogue with the artwork is created. It's not necessary to have the story in mind. On the contrary, you can also start in the middle of a story and then return to the beginning. Or you start even with the end and then turn back to the beginning. Think of the famous Columbus series starring Peter Falk, which began by showing who killed whom. And starting with the usual end is effectively eliminating of the usual build-up of tension. What they did was not to take the murder as the main thing, but rather the question of how Columbo proved that this too was not a perfect murder. And that is of course also an interesting option. You let the story develop along a certain logic line, and then it turns out that this is not the main line, but an apparently unimportant sideline is the main line. And that is also a nice way of making your story halfway, or that people think, hey, something is going on, but they cannot see exactly what is going on. Other figures in the story, both main and secondary, the ones who take action, experience emotions, and play a role in the events. Introducing the characters of your story is very more or less telling about what story it is going to be. However, like this work of Jacques de Loustal reveals very, very little. Yet you only have to look at it for a few minutes to generate so many questions that you can easily stumble across different stories. Well, as you understand, I love his work. The setting describes the place and time in which the story takes place. It can include details about the environment, the atmosphere, and the cultural context. A notable example is the Indonesian-born author and illustrator Tonke Dracht, whose books have been translated into many languages and adapted into films. Her book, The Letter of the King was chosen as the best Dutch novel of the latter half of the 20th century. I met her in the 80s when she was very enthusiastic about the book she was working on, Eyes of Tiger. So she asked me to make this postcard for her. It's presenting the cover she had designed. It's a typical example of many collages and drawings she made while writing a book. Sometimes they were very practical collages, primarily with an imaginary map. But as with this book, she mainly wanted to capture the atmosphere, which something and sometimes changed during the writing process, as can be clearly seen in the second collage. This technique can be very helpful in capturing the atmosphere of your story, or very capturing practical details. When you draw a map, you can always see how long it takes to go from one place to another. And what they see on that specific road. A detail that you sometimes can use in your story later. I'm not saying this is the reason why she's considered one of the best children's books writers in the Netherlands, but her approach adds a lot of depth to the story. Like sometimes she causally remarked earlier when her protagonist was driving on that road. And then later in her story, he revisits because it turned out to be a very important information. But that information was pages ago in the book. And then suddenly he goes back and then, oh, now I understand what I saw then. So when starting to work from a work of art, it's perfectly fine to take a photo and print it out to create your own collage, just for your own use. Because it's a bit difficult to say, but when you're writing, you only see your screen. But when you also have that illustration that walks with you through your story, that can help you really, really a lot. So the plot is the structure of the story, the sequence of events leading to the climax and the resolution. It's the plan or the structure of the story with all its twists and turns and causal connections. When I saw this painting, I wanted to know what was going on. And I think that anyone looking at this work by Kinga Samson will probably have the same reaction and wonder, what is going on there? It's something very mysterious, but what? Yes, I can look at it for a long, long time and I still don't know. But every time you can watch yourself. So when the plot is still promising, the conflict is more concrete. It's a tension or problem the characters must overcome. This can be an internal conflict, like a struggle with their own emotions, or an external conflict, like a struggle with another character or challenge in the environment. Well, maybe the most famous example is Edvard Munch, The Scream. It's interesting to study the difference between the black and white and his color versions. This effect is interesting because you can use it in how you write a story. We see that with the use of colors, it gives more description of the situation. The focus shifts more to the surrounding than in the black and white version, where the character draws most of the attention. When writing your story, you can, so to speak, start in color and gradually transition to black and white. Incidentally, we see here that the black and white version, because the character is more prominently featured, effectively addresses the viewer directly. If you incorporate this into your story as well, from a description to directing your storytelling directly to the reader, you have a great story. So the resolution of the conflict is often the end of the story. It reveals how the characters dealt with the challenges and what lessons they learned. However, a story can also have an open end, and then it's up to the reader to create a good resolution. Of course, the open end can be used to lead to a follow-up story. The biggest exception is, of course, the circle story. I like to use that form for stories for young children. The oldest known circle story originates from Japan. At the time, Japan had closed itself off, and only the Dutch, who had a trading post also in Indonesia, were allowed to do business there. They brought a story from Japan to Indonesia, and later from Indonesia to the Netherlands. I learned it at a young age, and later I created a modern version of the first circle story. But this is the story. The little stonemason was tired of carving and said, "Oh, I like to be the sun." So he could shine, and he was powerful and whatever. And one day and suddenly he became the sun. And he loved, and he was shining and things, till suddenly a cloud appeared in front of him. So he wanted to become that cloud, because the cloud didn't want to go away. And thus a cloud is more powerful than the sun. And poops, he became that cloud. Everything happened what he was wishing. And then he went. But then there was something that blew him away. It was wind. So he became the wind, which was most powerful than the cloud. And then there was the sea. And he blew, but the sea didn't care. And then he became the sea. And the sea was very strong and everything. It could move everything except that almighty mountain. But even when he was that mountain, he was not the most powerful. He sensed something more powerful, and he wanted to be that what was breaking him down. So he became himself again, and that's the circle. In this final collage by Joke van der Wijst, we see everything he had become. And the essence of the story is beautifully expressed by Friedrich Nietzsche. How someone becomes what they are. Yes, that happens often with us. Besides these essential elements, there are other aspects that can enrich a story, such as theme, perspective, style, symbolism, and other things. A story can also contain elements such as a hero, a villain, a thought-provoking theme. In short, a story is a combination of different elements that together should create a meaningful experience for the reader. If not, they will stop reading. So, there are also very special forms of storytelling, like this one, called live, dead and television viewing. It's also an 8-minute short film based on the story, and it's called Live and Dead. It's made in 1979 and was also rewarded with some rewards. So the story is based on an expanding image, and that's a very interesting idea. So when I saw the story, it was published in the 70s in the Haagse Post, a weekly magazine, and every week one drawing. The artist Joost Roelofs create a very special way of developing the story. The story emerged through increasing distance as what was initially very grand become increasingly detailed. You see the first illustration, it tells a lot of activities, but the week later it becomes small, and then you see it's only a part of a bigger part. And that's how the story went. Every time the story became smaller, and then we see more of the surrounding things. It's not easy, but telling a story like this, it has a very, very special effect. In the next video, we'll explore what the landscape has to offer to the storytelling. One thing we will definitely be discussing is perspective, a concept familiar to storytellers. So subscribe and you'll see when this video is finished. It always takes me some time to find some good illustrations in the art, because there is so much art. Thank you for watching the video, and when you have asked when you have questions or whatever, just ask me, or when you want to start in your own situation with helping people to learn a foreign language by writing stories, just contact me when you have questions, and you can do it anywhere, and people like it, they say to me. Thank you.